There was a moment when everything around me pointed to limitation, and every natural sign tried to convince me that increase was not possible. The numbers didn't lie, the obligations were pressing, and the visible reality seemed fixed and unmovable. But I began to understand that what I was seeing was only a snapshot, not the final outcome. I realized that if I kept agreeing with what I saw, I would stay bound to it. So I made a deliberate shift inside myself, choosing to align my words not with my circumstances, but with a higher truth. It wasn't easy at first because the mind always wants to return to what feels logical and safe. Yet faith does not operate by logic alone. It operates by trust in what has already been declared. I began to see that every word I spoke carried weight, shaping my expectations and influencing my direction. Instead of repeating the story of lack, I started introducing a new narrative of increase. Even when it felt unnatural, I stayed consistent because I knew consistency is what gives power to belief. Slowly, my thinking began to change, and with it came a quiet confidence that something unseen was already in motion. As I continued this practice, I became more aware of how easily negative words try to slip into daily conversation. It's often in casual moments that people reinforce the very things they don't want, speaking defeat without even realizing it. I had to train myself to pause and redirect my speech, making sure that what I said supported where I was going rather than where I had been. This required discipline, especially when emotions tried to take control and push me toward frustration or doubt. But I reminded myself that feelings are temporary, while words spoken in faith carry lasting impact. Each declaration of increase became like planting another seed, even if I couldn't yet see any visible growth. I understood that growth happens beneath the surface long before it appears outwardly. So I refused to measure progress only by what I could see, choosing instead to trust the process. Over time, this created a stronger inner foundation, one that was no longer shaken by external pressure. The more I spoke in alignment with increase, the more natural it became, until it started to feel like a part of who I was rather than something I was trying to do. There came a deeper realization that speaking in faith is not a one-time action, but a continual discipline that shapes the direction of life. I began to notice how repetition builds belief, and belief fuels expectation, and expectation eventually influences results. At first, it felt like I was just repeating words, but over time those words started to carry conviction. I understood that consistency is what separates empty speech from powerful declaration. Many people speak once and expect instant change, but spiritual principles respond to persistence, not impatience. So I committed to speaking increase daily, regardless of how things looked or felt. I treated my words like seeds being planted into unseen soil, knowing that each one had the potential to produce a harvest. Even when doubt tried to interrupt, I answered it with stronger declarations. I refused to let negative thoughts take root because I knew they would eventually produce negative outcomes. The more I practiced this, the more my inner environment began to shift toward confidence and expectation. I also realized that guarding my words required awareness in every situation, not just during quiet moments of reflection. Conversations with others, reactions to challenges, and even small comments had to be brought under control. It became clear that careless words could undo intentional faith if left unchecked. So I became more intentional, choosing to speak life even in situations that seemed frustrating or unfair. This didn't mean ignoring reality, but it meant refusing to give it authority over my future. I trained myself to respond differently, to speak what I wanted to see rather than what I was experiencing. Over time, this created a noticeable shift in how I handled pressure, replacing anxiety with a sense of calm assurance. The discipline of speaking right words began to influence not just my finances, but my overall mindset and attitude. I started to expect good outcomes instead of preparing for disappointment. This expectation wasn't based on circumstances, but on the steady practice of aligning my words with increase. Then I began to understand something even more powerful, that words are not only expressions but carriers of creative force that shape the direction of outcomes over time. Every word spoken in faith was like releasing a command into motion, setting unseen processes into alignment with what was being declared. At first, the change was subtle and almost unnoticeable, but I refused to measure progress by immediate results. I kept reminding myself that just because something isn't visible doesn't mean it isn't happening. The natural world often lags behind the spiritual, and what is spoken in faith must first take root before it can manifest outwardly. This required patience, but not a passive kind of waiting, rather an active expectation that something was already shifting behind the scenes. I stayed focused on maintaining the right words, even when there was no external confirmation. Each declaration strengthened my belief, and each moment of consistency reinforced the direction I had chosen. I became less concerned with how long it would take and more committed to staying aligned with the process. Over time, that alignment created a steady sense of certainty that what I had been speaking was already on its way. As this understanding grew stronger, I started to notice small changes that pointed toward a larger shift taking place. Opportunities began to appear in unexpected ways, and ideas came that I hadn't considered before. It was as if speaking increase had opened a pathway for new possibilities to enter my life. I didn't chase these opportunities with fear or desperation, but with confidence, knowing they were part of a greater flow. What once felt like struggle began to feel like movement, and what once felt stuck began to show signs of progress. I realized that increase doesn't always arrive all at once. It often begins with small, consistent steps that build momentum over time. Each step forward confirmed that something real was happening, even if it wasn't yet at its full expression. This strengthened my commitment to keep speaking and believing without wavering. I understood that stopping midway could interrupt what had already been set in motion, so I chose to remain steady. The more I stayed consistent, the clearer it became that the words I had been speaking were shaping a reality that was gradually becoming visible. Then I came to a place where I recognized that resistance is often the final barrier before visible change begins to appear. It was in those moments when things seemed unchanged or even more challenging that the temptation to go back to old patterns became strongest. Thoughts would suggest that nothing was working, that the effort was pointless, and that speaking differently had no real effect. But I understood that this was not a signal to stop, it was a test of consistency and conviction. I had to decide whether I would be moved by what I felt or remain anchored in what I had been declaring. This is where discipline became essential, choosing to continue speaking increase even when emotions tried to pull me in the opposite direction. I reminded myself that every seed faces resistance before it breaks through the surface. That resistance is not a sign of failure, but an indication that something is developing beneath. So instead of retreating, I leaned further into the process, strengthening my commitment to stay aligned with the words I had been speaking. At the same time, I became more aware of the importance of protecting the environment around my faith. Not everyone will understand the decision to speak differently, and some may even challenge it with doubt or negativity. I realized that allowing those voices to influence my thinking could weaken the consistency I had built. So I made a conscious effort to limit the impact of negative input, choosing instead to focus on what supported growth and belief. This didn't mean isolating myself completely, but it meant being selective about what I allowed to shape my mindset. I also learned to guard my internal dialogue, because sometimes the loudest doubts come from within rather than from others. By continually redirecting my thoughts and reinforcing my declarations, I maintained a steady direction forward. This created a kind of inner stability that wasn't easily shaken by external pressure. The more I protected that environment, The stronger my confidence became, and the easier it was to remain consistent regardless of circumstances.